touch me, I'm a real live wire. Psycho killer, qu'est-ce que c'est? Better run, 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 run away.
You enter the house of your dreams. You've been waiting a long time for this. The house is set up like its original state back in 1912. No, you didn't just buy the home, but you get to spend a night there, investigating. This home is the infamous site of the Villisca axe murders, an unsolved case that took place on June 9th, 10th, 1912. So the stage is set. It looks pretty close to what it did the night of this horrific crime. The only thing that's missing is an axe. So instead you bring a hunting knife. You're going to use that as a trigger object. You head upstairs and lie in the bed where one of the murders took place. You place the hunting knife on your chest and you start calling out the murderer who did this. You don't get much of a response. In fact, you don't get any response, and you step it up a notch and you start calling out, "You son of a bitch. How could you do this? What kind of fucking coward are you? Come out. I dare you." And then you pass out. And when you wake up, there's a hunting knife buried into your chest that has punctured your lung. You don't remember anything. What the hell happened? Well, that's part of the story that I'm going to tell you about today. That's right. We are going to talk about the Villisca axe murder home. So welcome everybody to Disembodied, your friendly neighborhood paranormal podcast. And sit yourself down and relax and get ready to get your boo on. The man that I was talking to you about is Buck Laursen. He was doing an overnight investigation at the Villisca axe murder house. In fact, what I'm going to do is play you a clip right now of him talking to Amy Bruni from the show Kindred Spirits and him telling you about what happened. Here we go.
I had done a lot of research into what the crime scene looked like. I had set this crime scene up the way they had found it. And since I don't have the axe, I have a hunting knife on my chest. And I started to provoke. And I look over to the closet, and it was the biggest orb I've ever seen. And I remember screaming. The knife was in my lung and shoulder. And I woke up, tied to a bed, chewed down my throat. And I do remember this. I didn't do it to myself. There is something there. My stepfather and my mother have an EVP, and you hear a voice, plain as day, say, "Don't worry about Buck, we'll get him." Unfortunately, my mother destroyed everything. It was a little whisper, a little on the quiet side. You say the wrong thing about the wrong spirit, and you're going to pay for it.
So that is very chilling. Although Buck's health wasn't great going into this investigation, it has deteriorated to the point where he's a very sick man now, barely able to get by every day. So it's very unfortunate, and I wish the best for him. It is on my list to go visit the Villisca axe murder house. In fact, I spoke to Martha Lynn, a very lively 82-year-old woman. Had a really cool conversation with her, and we'll talk about her and her husband, Darwin, who bought the house back in 1998, I believe. Anyway, let's talk about what happened. What took place in this home that was so horrific? If you were to go drive by the home right now, it looks like many other older homes do, where lives are lived and families share all the good, bad, and everything that's experienced in life. Only no one lives in this house. No one has lived there in a very long time. There is a sign out front of the house that announces that this is the infamous Villisca axe murder house. And here's a story. Trigger warning, I'm about to discuss some very detailed aspects of this case that involve the murder of children. On June 9th, two sisters, Lena and Ina Stillinger, had the whole day to themselves. They were going to go to Sunday morning services, and afterwards they were going to spend the day with their grandmother. In the evening, they went back to the church to attend the Children's Day exercises that started at 8 p.m. Originally, they were going to go back to their grandmother's house for a sleepover, but they were invited to stay over at the Moore house. The Moore's family had 4 children who were friends with the Stillinger girls. With their parents' permission, they happily agreed. The event ended at 9:30 p.m., and the Moore family with their guests headed home. And it is believed that they arrived home around 10 o'clock. At 5 the next morning, their next-door neighbor, Mary Peckham, started her day by going outside and hanging some laundry. The Moores were early risers, as all farm families are, and they had livestock to attend to. Mary had recounted that the house seemed eerily quiet. At 7:30, 8 o'clock, Mary still had not heard nor see the family, so she went next door to check on them. She knocked on the door, and when she didn't get an answer, she tried the doorknob, but it was locked. Concerned, she called Mr. Josiah Moore, the owner of the house's brother, Ross. Ross, too, tried to get into the home. He knocked on the door, he tried to open the door, and he looked in the windows, but the curtains were closed. After no response, he found a key to the house and entered. The house was silent. He proceeded to the main floor bedroom, and what he found was horrific. There were 2 bloody bodies covered in blankets lying on their beds. There was no sign of life. Ross immediately left the home and asked Mary Peckham to call the sheriff. The victims were 12-year-old Lena Stillinger and her 8-year-old sister Ina. They were not the only victims. In the upstairs bedrooms, the entire Moore family lay dead in their beds. All of their heads had been bashed in with an axe. The victims were 43-year-old Josiah Moore, 39-year-old Sarah Moore, 11-year-old Herman Moore, 9-year-old Catherine Moore, 7-year-old Boyd Moore, and 5-year-old Paul Moore. It was June 10th, 1912. Serial killers and mass murderers had not even been thought of or even identified yet. There were no FBI behavioral science teams, CSI, DNA analysis, or any other knowledge of managing a scene and processing and analyzing evidence. The news of the murders got around fast, and it has been reported that up to 100 morbidly curious townspeople trampled through the House of Horrors, disrespectfully gawking at the victims. And it wasn't until around noon that law enforcement finally confined the scene to just police and doctors. The following is a list of evidence that they were able to gather from the scene. Now, I got a lot of this information from a website called VilliscaIowa.com, and I will put that in the show notes. 8 people were bludgeoned to death with an axe. They were likely asleep when they were killed, and it was estimated that the murders took place between midnight and 5 o'clock. All the curtains were drawn, except for 2 that didn't have any curtains, but they were covered with the Moore's family clothing. The victims' faces were covered with bed sheets, blankets, or clothing after they were killed. A kerosene lamp was found at the end of Sarah and Josiah's bed. The glass chimney cover was found under the dresser, and the wick had been bent back. It was the same in the room that the Stillinger girl stayed in. The axe that was believed to be owned by Josiah was used to kill the family, and it was found also in the Stillinger girl's room. It was bloody, but it looked like an attempt had been made to clean it off. There were gouge marks in the ceiling from the axe's upswing motion. And there was a fragment of a keychain found in the downstairs bedroom floor. A pan of bloody water was found on the kitchen table along with some uneaten food. All the doors were locked. And weirdly, there was a 2-pound slab of bacon in the Stillinger girl's room right beside the axe. It was believed that after all the murders, the killer went back upstairs and inflicted some more wounds on Josiah and Sarah. It's possible that if these horrible crimes were committed today, they may have been solved. And it can be easy to blame the cops and how the scene was managed, but like I said, different times and different knowledge. This crime has never been solved, and this sick bastard took his secret to the grave. That's if he's dead. I mean, he'd be pretty damn old right now. After the crime scene was investigated, the coroner, Dr. Lindquist, and a night watchman, Henry Horton, and Sheriff Orrin Jackson met and reviewed the evidence. The bodies of the victims were not moved until 10 p.m., and then they were transported to a fire station, which was set up as a temporary morgue. There was a coroner's inquest, and 14 witnesses were called, and I believe their testimony fills in some of the blanks, so I'm going to read some of it to you. So Mary Peckham was questioned, and we already talked about her involvement. And then there was a man by the name of Ed Selly. He was an employee of Josiah's implement store, and he was asked by Mary Peckham and Josiah's brother if he had heard or seen of him. He said that he hadn't and was asked to go to the farm to attend to the horses. He went, but he didn't check the house. And then he returned back to the store. As soon as he returned, he was told to go right back to the house, but get the marshal and call the coroner. Ed was asked if he knew if Josiah had any enemies, and he said, quote, "Josiah says, I got a brother-in-law that don't like me. Said he would get even with me sometime." End of quote. He was talking about Sam Moyer, and Selly denied knowing anything else. The next person questioned was Dr. J. Clark Cooper, and he was the first physician to arrive on the scene. He was visited by Hank Horton at 8:15, who appeared very unsettled. He was asked to go to the Moore house because of the murders, and when he arrived, he went into the house with Dr. Hoff and a minister by the name of Mr. Ewing. And this is a report he gave. I'm just going to read what he said. So, quote, "All we could see was an arm of someone sticking from under the edge of the cover with blood on the pillows. And I went over and lifted the covers, and I saw what supposed was a body. Some entire stranger, a mere child, at the back of the bed. I did not recognize him at all, neither did any of the people, the others then that were with me, and we merely saw that they were dead, and that there were only two in the bed, and then we stepped out of the parlor. The lamp was on the foot of the bed in our way, so Hank set it up to one side to allow us to pass. And Hank was ahead of me, and he walked around the corner to the left-hand side of the bed and turned the cover back and said, 'Here's Joe.' And I merely glanced over there the first time. And as I came up, and I saw that Mr. and Mrs. Moore were both dead, and I immediately went to the south room and left the other people with them. I do not know whether any of them came with me to the south room, but I left plenty of them in the north room. Well, I went to the south room, and then we began to count the children. The bedding was pretty stiff at the head of the bed, and the blood and the brains on the pillow had contracted, as it does when killed, will dry, so that it's perfect jelly at that time, and the blood clots were dry." End of quote. He estimated that the Moores and the Stillingers had been dead for at least 5 to 6 hours. Cooper also testified that he smelled no unusual or antiseptic odor in the house, and it seemed that the faces of the victims had been covered after they were murdered. Quote, "I saw no clothes sticking into any of the wounds in my superficial examinations. Neither did I see any clothing that had any holes in it. I mean, any of the sheets or pillows. Nothing had a hole in it." End of quote. The next person that was interviewed was Jessie Moore. Mrs. Moore was the wife of Josiah's brother and took the phone call from Mary Peckham. She entered the house later that day to retrieve family photos, and she did not know of Josiah having any enemies. The next was Dr. F.S. Williams. He was the physician that examined the bodies of the murder victims, the second physician to enter the home. When he arrived, people were going in and out of the house. When asked to describe the position of the bodies, Williams went on to say, quote, "The faces were beaten in. In the bedroom to the south, at the left hand, east of the room was a cot. Another bed standing there with a little boy in it. He was sleeping on his stomach, and top of his head was beaten in. There was a gauze shirt on top of his head, soaked with blood, and I lifted it off to see which one it was. Then in the bed angling on the other foot of the bed, southeast corner of the room, was another bed with a little girl, and her head was beaten in. And on the top of her head was a little dress, and it was covered and blood splattered, and I think that it was partially curled up over her head and covers pulled up over her face. And in the bed to the southwest corner of the room were two little boys lying with both the tops of their heads beaten in, blood splattered on everything, and the blood was all over the pillows." End of quote. When he entered the downstairs bedroom, William said that he saw the two girls. Quote, "From their appearances, one was a big woman and a little girl, and that the little girl on the outside of the bed next to the east side were in. She evidently moved after having been struck, or had been moved. The blood was scattered all over the pillows, apparently as she'd been struck on the head, squirmed down in the bed perhaps 1/3 of the way, and the left hand was thrown back, was sticking up below the pillow, and her head was all beaten in. and I took particular attention to the axe wound, and that the edge had come out of the forehead, so I could see the sharp edge. Well, the top side of it. I did not recognize either one of the little girls. The little girl in the front of the bed I thought looked familiar, but she was so mutilated that I wasn't able to identify her at the time. And I think over, the little girl to the back of the bed was a little boy's gray coat, and it had been thrown over her head. And there was clothing, some clothing on the floor, some underwear, and I noticed under the bed was also dresses hanging up, laying or hanging up on the wall, or the foot of the bed. I forget which. There was blood on it. I looked to see if there was any possible signs that there might have been attempted intercourse or rape or something, but I did not notice any. End of quote. I just can't imagine how horrific that would be. I mean, the person that did this was an absolute monster and a coward. They suspect that he may have hidden up in the attic, waiting for them to come home, fall asleep, and then do this horrific deed. This had to be one sick son of a bitch to do it. Anyway, moving forward, the next person that was interviewed was Ed Sanders, the son of a neighbor, and he said that he went to bed at 9. And around that time, he heard a boy scream from outside somewhere. And it wasn't until after that he heard of the murders that he saw the significance. There was the brother Ross Moore who had discussed, and Josiah's other brothers, Fenwick Moore and Henry Moore, and a nephew, Lee Van Gilder. And they said they didn't know anything of his brother's business. And then Blanche Stellinger, the oldest sister of the girls, and Joseph Stillinger, the father. They knew about them sleeping over, but they had nothing more to add. Let's talk about the suspects. When it came to the murders, almost everyone in the town was considered a suspect. The town had become paranoid. Fingers were pointed at each other. Shops were sold out of guns and ammunition, and doors were locked. Townspeople turned on each other. Rumors were spread. This tragedy had threatened to blow this little town apart. Like I said, nobody was off the hook for this. In fact, Frank F. Jones, a Villisca resident and Iowa state senator, was targeted. Apparently, there was some kind of dispute between Frank F. Jones and Josiah Moore over a John Deere franchise about their store selling John Deere products. And apparently, Frank F. Jones was really upset about it, and fingers were pointed at him to the murder. It was thought that the next suspect, William Blackie Mansfield, was hired by Frank F. Jones to do the murder. William Blackie Mansfield was from Blue Island, Illinois. He became the prime suspect of the Burns Detective Agency of Kansas City and Detective James Newton Wilkerson. Wilkerson believed that Mansfield was a cokehead and a serial killer. He also believed that Mansfield was responsible for the axe murders of his wife, infant child, father-in-law, and mother-in-law in Blue Island, Illinois, on July 5th, 1914, 2 years after the Villisca murders. The axe murders committed in Puyallup, Kansas, 4 days before the Villisca axe murders, and the murders of Jenny Peterson and Jenny Miller of Aurora, Colorado. All were killed the same way. Now, Wilkinson managed to convince a grand jury to open an investigation in 1916, and Mansfield was arrested and was brought to Montgomery County from Kansas City. Payroll records, however, provided an alibi that placed Mansfield in Illinois at the time of the Villisca murders. He was released for lack of evidence and later won a lawsuit that was brought against Wilkinson, and he was awarded $2,225, which was a huge amount of money back then. The next suspect is one of great controversy because a lot of people believe that he was actually the one that did it. And this is Reverend George Kelly. He was a traveling preacher, and he was a crazed maniac. Even his wife thought he was nuts. Kelly and his wife settled in Macedonia, Iowa in 1912 after several years of preaching throughout the Midwest. In 1917, Kelly was arrested and charged with the murders of the victims of the Villisca axe murders. Kelly had been invited to the church to attend the Children's Day exercises at the Presbyterian Church on June 9th, 1912. And his presence in Villisca on the night of the murders and his subsequent departure the early next morning, June 10th, made him a prime suspect in the case. Now, Kelly supposedly confessed and made a mockery of law enforcement practices at the time and was withdrawn before the trial even began. Kelly's first trial resulted in a hung jury, and he was finally acquitted by the second. According to the information by Kelly and Tammy Rundle, quote, Kelly moved to Kansas City, Connecticut, and finally New York City. The remaining years of his life and his final resting place remain a mystery, end of quote. Now, the next person is someone that I think is really intriguing. Out of all of them, I think it's very possible that he could have done it. And this guy is Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the Moore family that were murdered. He was thought to be a serial killer. On May of 1913, a federal officer by the name of M.W. McClary was assigned to the Villisca case. And he believed that he had solved the Villisca murders as well as 22 others because he thought the same person did it in the Midwest around the same time frame. He believed that it was Henry Lee Moore and that he was responsible for all the crimes. Now, Moore had actually been convicted of the murders of his mother and maternal grandmother in Columbia, Missouri, just months after the murders in Villisca, and they were killed just as brutally as each other. His weapon of choice was an axe. In 1900, Henry was living with a family in Franklin County, Iowa, and he worked as a farmhand, and they believe that he impregnated a young girl of the farmer. He was sentenced to Kansas State Reformatory in Hutchinson, Kansas on a forgery charge and was released April 11th, 1911. Just 9 months before the crime in Villisca, H.C. Wayne, his wife and child, and Mrs. A.J. Burnham and her 2 children were bludgeoned with an axe in Colorado Springs, Colorado. A month later, in October of 1911, a family was killed in Monmouth, Illinois. And just a week later, 5 members of a family in Ellsworth, Kansas were murdered as they slept by an axe. Just a week before the killing of the Moores and the Stillingers in Villisca, a man and his wife were killed in Paola, Kansas. I hope I'm saying it right. It's Paola. The similarities in the crimes were striking. Now, McClary received some information about Moore's conviction because his father was a warden of Leavenworth, Kansas Federal Penitentiary, and it was believed that Moore had committed all of the murders. But McClary's evidence was pretty much ignored, and Henry Moore was not convicted of any of the crimes. Now, this is where you can see that they were very similar. In Colorado Springs on June 15, 1912, police officials were in constant touch with the Villisca authorities, and they talked about the parallels in the Moore and the Burnham-Wayne murders. For instance, the murderer hung clothes across the windows to prevent anyone looking into the house. He covered the heads of the victims with bedclothing, wiped the blood from the axe, and removed the stains from his hands and clothing. So like I said, the parallels are there. This guy axe murdered his mother and grandmother. He was a shady, greasy guy who impregnated a young girl, possibly. He worked from place to place. He didn't really have a job to hold down. He lived with a family far into his 30s, and he was transient, and he was in the Midwest, and he kills with an axe. So it's possible that he went to these places and murdered these people, and maybe there was a confession in prison. Who knows? We'll never know. The thing is, he did serve 36 years in prison for the murder of his mom and grandmother. He was later released at the age of 82, and no one really knows what happened to him after that. The next person is Andy Sawyer. Now, there was no real evidence that linked him to the crime. However, his name came up often in the grand jury testimonies, basically because he was a little weird. Maybe he had some mental illness or some substance abuse problems, but because he acted a little strange and he said maybe some weird things, they targeted him as someone who could possibly have caused the murders. So he showed up in the Villisca area looking for a job as an extra man at the Burlington Railroad. And the foreman, Mr. Dyer, needed an extra man, so he was hired on the spot. While he was there, the murders took place, and the newspaper carried the story. Now, according to Dyer, Sawyer was very much interested in the case. And the crew that worked there complained about Sawyer because he slept in his clothes and he was anxious to be by himself. and that he slept with an axe beside him. So they thought maybe he could be an axe murderer. Another report was that Dyer said that he walked up behind Sawyer once and he was rubbing his head with both of his hands, and then he suddenly jumped up because he was startled and said to him, quote, "I will cut your goddamn heads off." At the same time, he made striking motions with the axe and began hitting the piles in front of him. He also started to tell people that he knew how the murderer would have gotten away from the scene. So by jumping out the window onto some boxes or something like that. So this guy really wasn't helping himself, but I don't think he was guilty. It doesn't sound like it. It sounds like a guy that was a little off and sort of doing his own thing. And in a time of great paranoia, he was targeted and he was eventually let go. So ending with the suspect list here, over time, many people confessed, as they do for some reason in these horrible crimes, maybe for attention. God only knows. And at the end of the day, no one was charged for these murders, and it remains a cold case. Sometimes when a horrible crime is committed, there is folklore attached to it, and it was no different in this case. There's just a couple of things here. First of all, people thought maybe, or spread the rumor that it was a revenge killing gone wrong, that the guy went to the wrong house and murdered the Moores and their guests. Another one, and I've heard this before, is that they say the image of the killer was imprinted onto one of the retinas of the Stillinger girls. So that one's gotten around quite a bit. And I don't know if that's possible, but that makes for a good horror movie. I wonder. There's probably been 10 movies that have done that or more. If you guys know of anyone, let me know, because I'd like to see how they do it. So let's talk about this infamous house, because it has a personality of its own. It's an entity of its own. If it were in a movie, which actually it's been in movies, it's a character in the movie. It was built in 1886 by George Loomis. It was bought by Josiah Moore in 1903, and after the murder in 1912, it stayed in the state until 1915. After that, it was believed to be owned by somewhere between 7 to 13 people and families, and rented out to people as well. The current owner is Martha Lynn. Martha and her husband, Darwin, bought the house back in 1994, and the house had gone through many changes and renovations throughout the years. Martha and Darwin owned a museum in the town and decided to restore the home to its original state. It is now a historical heritage home. People can now go for day tours or stay overnight. Paranormal investigators, fear seekers, and true crime enthusiasts have flocked to the home over the years. Some of the biggest paranormal teams, psychics, TV shows have been there. The Villisca axe murders have also been covered by many podcasts, like this one, and YouTube channels. People have been gathering evidence over the years to see if they can speak to the dead and maybe find out who the murderer was. Many approaches have been taken. Some try to connect with the victims, and others call out and antagonize the murder. There has been much reported activity, and here's a list. Now, I talked already about Buck Larson, who ended up with a hunting knife in his chest. That actually got a lot of press, too. I guess it attracted a lot of people to there and begs the question of what are safe practices in paranormal investigating? At what point are people taking it too far? Some people have been scratched and bitten, touched and pushed. Disembodied voices and growls and breaths and screams have been captured on EVPs. Cold spots, mists, orbs, dark figures, apparition. And there are pictures that you can find online that show the face of a little boy in a window and some faces and some apparitions within the home. You can go online to YouTube and find a ton of information about the Villisca axe murder house and the murders themselves. I mentioned earlier that I had spoken to Martha Lynn, and the reason why, which you probably have gathered, is that I plan on going with my team to visit there in the new year, because I already have a trip planned to Randolph Infirmary in Winchester, Iowa, and I cannot wait to go to that, and I will be doing an episode on that, of course. And so this ends today's episode. The question I have for you is, would you go spend a night at the Villisca Axe Murder House? I know that I'm planning on doing it. How would you approach investigating this place? My approach is to go in there gentle and respectful, try to reach out to any of the victims, and gather whatever information I can from there and pay respect to the dead. That's how I go about doing it. I really don't want to feed any more dark energy that already might be there. But that's just me. And also, remember to look over your shoulders because you never know, someone might be watching you. Take care of yourself, take care of each other. Peace. One love.
Slowly I turn, step by step. Through the back window I crept, silent as a mouse on the set. While everybody in the house slept, I disconnect the phones and the rest.